So while I'm introducing Marty and he's introducing himself, I'd like to throw out a little polling question because today's discussion about estimating resistance strength is a uh, large factor when it comes to using the tool itself. So you can have as many of you know, a large swing on your results. So this is Marty Miracle's coming out party, I would say. How about that, Marty? So welcome to the CXOware team and welcome to the community. Why don't you provide us a little background on yourself? Give us a few little personal tidbits, and then we'll let you, launch off into this discussion.
Sure. Let me pull up here. You want to make me presenter, and
Not quite yet. Why don't,
okay.
Yeah, I'm someone got this poll going, sir. Let's get a few more votes in. All right, thanks.
Again, my name is Marty Miracle. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer for CXOware. That's a fancy way of saying all the business development, sales, and marketing efforts and messages and things like that fall under my umbrella. I've been with CXOware for about 2 months now. Before that, I was with a number of large financial institutions in kind of implementing quantitative risk using FAIR and FAIR IQ into those companies. I've been familiar with FAIR and Jack Jones since about 2005, and I'm one of the few and only certified FAIR master practitioners that there are out there, and as a lot of you know, it's almost a joke because it doesn't exist anymore. And I think I may have been the only one who got it back before Jack actually started CXOware. So all that means is I've just been around a while using FAIR. And Jack likes to say that I've probably done more cool analysis on different things than even he has done. And that's just a byproduct of some of the organizations that I worked in and some of the very interesting questions that I was asked to answer. And my having FAIR as a model to dissect risk has been very useful with the companies that I worked for. And I was, so I'm going to show my screen now. So here, now we can get on to the more boring stuff.
All right. Well, hey, just to give you a little frame of reference, Marty, in that poll, there was only 24% of the audience that have not used one of the tools that are out there for FAIR. So I think your audience is tuned in pretty well to what you're going to talk to today.
Sure. I appreciate that. What I'd like to talk to you today about is the idea of using the concept of a baseline measure of force to estimate resistance strength when you're doing FAIR analysis. And we talk about who should use this method. It's really people who are actually performing risk analysis using FAIR. So if you're not using FAIR when you do any of your risk analysis now, then this concept won't be something that you can use. It's also for people who need help estimating resistance strength consistently and systematically. And why it's important to be able to do resistance strength consistently and systematically is because the relationship between threat capability in the FAIR model and resistive strength in the FAIR model, those two together are used to derive vulnerability. So the model is very sensitive to the inputs for both TCAP and resistance strength. So if we're careless or undisciplined in how we estimate resistance strength in our analysis, the analysis could end up being fatally flawed. If you have a lack of discipline or a poorly implemented way of doing resistance strength, when you play that off against threat capability to produce a vulnerability result, then take that vulnerability result and mesh it with the threat event frequency to derive loss event frequency. If any of those underlying factors are flawed, then your results are going to be flawed as well. So this is one of the reasons why I kind of came up with this method of doing resistance strength systematically, is because I kind of run into those problems when I was doing FAIR analysis at the companies that I worked for. So I kind of thought of a way of kind of making it more systematic. Now, there's plenty of caveats, addendums, and disclaimers to this. First and foremost being this method is not one that's taught in FAIR training currently. It's not one you can sit down with Jack and say, Jack, how do I systematically and estimate resistance strength? So it hasn't been built in any of the training, so kind of use this at your own risk. This method relies on estimating, the concept of estimating. It relies on estimates. So if you aren't comfortable with estimating, you won't like using this method either. And because neither RS or TCAP have a universally agreed upon empirical scale for measurement, in other words, we don't have an inches of feet, a miles per hour, a newtons per meter foot-pounds, those kinds of things developed for RS and TCAP, then the method that I perform suffers from the same inherent fuzziness that already exists in the model. This concept also relies on a very strict FAIR-based definition for resistance strength in TCAP. So if you don't like using the FAIR-based definitions for resistance strength in TCAP, you won't like this method for estimating RS either. And last but not least, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask away. But if you're convinced that this method is just complete crap, that it makes no sense and this isn't useful, even considering the limitations I've listed above, then call me afterwards and I'll let you humiliate me all you want. But I don't think we have time on this call for you to actually pick apart the basis of the model, the approach itself. But I'm certainly willing to listen to any of your challenges, and you can help me improve what's here, or maybe we have to have another one of these virtual community of interest meetings where I discredit my own work. So I'm certainly open for that.
Hey, Marty.
So now we can get started with it. Yep.
I did advertise to the audience, though, that they asked a question that would stump you. They'd get a $25 Starbucks gift card from Steve. So that's an offer that's out there, standing offer. And secondly, we've had several requests for you to get closer to your microphone and increase the volume.
All right. How's that? Is that any better?
Oh, much better. Yes, thanks.
Okay. I'll put the mic right next to my throat. So if we're ready to get started, I'll kind of get into the idea itself here. And so if we start with the idea of resistance strength in the FAIR model, it's defined as a measure of the ability to resist against a baseline measure of force. That's kind of the definition that we get in the FAIR model itself. So when we go to estimate resistance strength, the next thing we realize is, well, what baseline measure of force are we going to use to measure RS against or measure it with? And so in the FAIR model, we do have some definitions for what actually exerts force, and that's what we define threat as. Threat is that thing that can exert force. Now, when we go to actually expressing how the amount of force that a threat can exert, we describe that as threat capability. So if we want to use a baseline measure of force following the FAIR definitions, we would actually the baseline measure of force can be measured in threat capability. Which brings us to the next question in the FAIR model. How do we actually use threat capability as the baseline for estimating resistance strength? So as many of you know, threat capability in the FAIR model is expressed on the idea of having a capability continuum. Capability being defined as the skills and resources that an attacker can use. And the reason it's described as a continuum is because threat capabilities are increasing over time. They're getting more skills, more resources. There's new tools being invented progressively. And so there's never a point in time in which threat capability is a static thing. If it is, it's only a point in time thing, and it may not be true tomorrow. But on either end of the continuum, we can express it as things like the barely breathing on one end and experts on the other end. And of course, threat capability can be described as moving along points along that continuum. With that asks the questions, how capable is barely breathing if we're going to measure its capability, or how capable is an expert in their skills and resources that they can bring to bear against your company? No fancy movement there, doesn't want to make. In other words, how capable is barely breathing on a minimum, most likely maximum estimation? And how capable is the idea of an expert at a minimum, most likely maximum, and again, the confidence rating? How can we estimate those, especially knowing that skills and resources are constantly evolving and they're not fully defined or not known at this point in time? So I uncovered the idea of a need for a model for things like expert. Can we envision a threat agent who has nearly unlimited and progressively increasing skills and resources? If we could profile this expert, we could establish a threat capability for that expert and use this as a baseline for estimating RS by comparing it to the ability of that expert. So we needed a model for this idea of expert, and I propose that we found one. There is a threat agent out there with nearly unlimited skills and resources. I present to you Tom Cruise as Ethan Hunt, IMF super agent. Some of you are probably laughing out there, but if the idea, this is just my concept of what an expert would be on the threat continuum, understanding that skills and resources change and are constantly evolving. somebody like Tom Cruise is Ethan Hunt and his IMF team, probably more like his IMF team as well as him, because some of these things that I'm listing here that he's done are actually stuff that he brought his team members in to do. But things like being able to make a new face and a voice on the fly, and while they imitate somebody in the bathroom to kidnap somebody else. The ability to scale tall buildings using a couple of suction cups and slingshotting off another building. The ability to hack the CIA and get out, get in there and get into the room where no one else is entered unless they have pass through 6 different checkpoints. And I mean, even as chewing gum that doubles as an explosive. So that's obviously pretty cool. But this is an idea of thinking of a threat agent that has progressively improving skills and resources that would fit kind of that expert profile on the threat continuum. Again, it's not a perfect comparison because he doesn't actually exist. But as we get some idea, if we look at what the things that he's capable of doing, the tools and resources that are available to something like even a fictional character like this, we get some idea of what can be out there from a threat perspective, from skills and resources that could be applied. And especially considering the idea that we're trying to make forward-looking statements when we do this. So if we start with the idea of Tom Cruise as Ethan Hunt, and we estimate his threat capability. Again, this is just an estimate. The estimate might look something like this. Again, these are kind of made-up numbers. I'm not proposing that you use these or that you even use Ethan Hunt as Tom Cruise as your expert, but it's just one that I found useful and kind of resonates in people's minds when I actually go through doing analysis and ask them to envision something like this. So if we put a range of capabilities somewhere between the, at least in the top 10 percentile and most likely in the top, only 1% better, and as a maximum, there's nobody better out there. If you are there, a 1/10 of a percentile point out there of someone available with more skills and resources. If we start with there, then what we can, and we then go to the other end of the capability continuum to do barely breathing. Barely breathing might look something like this. The minimum they got 1 percentile. This is probably too high a range on the maximum for describing the skills and resources that barely breathing would bring to the table. But if you baseline something like this, and you could even profile barely breathing and create some type of envision what barely breathing would actually look like, as much like we did with Ethan Hunt and Tom Cruise, to give you a clearer picture of what it would look like. You could actually identify something like that as well. But if not, set a realistic threat capability range for barely breathing. And now you have on either end of the threat continuum, you have something that models what their capability would look like. You may want to do something like an average attacker too, somewhere in the middle. And an average attacker would look something like this from a minimum, most likely, and a maximum of threat capability. I found it useful too to kind of do something in between average and Tom Cruise, because often when you compare controls to their ability to stop Tom Cruise, you're going to find that you don't have any, that you're completely vulnerable to him. So I moved down the next layer of the skill, and I see, a professional attacker, someone who's not at Tom Cruise's level, doesn't have those skills and resources. Instead of a 3D face plotter out there, he's just making masks he's trying to put over. Still waiting on the 3D printers to become cheap enough for him to afford, that kind of person. Their capability might look something like this. Again, these are just made-up ranges. You'd have to do these for yourself if you wanted to apply this approach. But now that we kind of have a range out there, if we start with Tom Cruise as his threat capability being 90 all the way up to 99.9 percentile, we now would evaluate our resistive controls that we have in place and identify the gaps in those controls, the controls that we have in place to prevent Tom Cruise from doing all the awesome things that he's able to do. So then you ask yourself the question, would your controls at their very best stop Tom Cruise at his very minimum RS? In other words, could your best controls stop up to the 90th percentile of attacker? Well, if the answer is yes, then you see you already have an established maximum for your resistance strength. You could establish your maximum at matching his minimum, and that'd be a 90th percentile. Let's say no, there's no way you could possibly do that. We need to move on to another point that we've identified in our threat capability continuum and see if we can baseline against that. So we can start at the other end and say, barely breathing. If they're 1, 5 to 10 percentile in their capability, again, evaluating our resistive controls, we ask ourselves the questions, would our controls at a minimum stop barely breathing? The answer is probably yes for most situations. So then we know that if we're able to stop the maximum ability of barely breathing, we would know that our minimum resistance strength would match that. And we could set our minimum at 10 percentile. And then knowing we can't stop Tom Cruise at all, we can then move down the next spot we've identified on our capability continuum to the professional. And we could ask ourselves, what control at best would stop the professional? What are controls at best stop the professional at his max resistive strength? Max, that's actually max capability. Sorry about that. If the answer is yes, then what we've identified is the maximum in our range. We've identified that our controls at best would stop his maximum. We could set it at the 90th percentile. So now we have a range at a minimum and a maximum. We could then say, well, that seems like a pretty wide range. What about if we compare it to the average capability attacker out there? We could ask ourselves, what are controls at a minimum stop the average attacker? If our answer is yes, then we can move our range up to look something more like this. So now we have the resistance strength set at a minimum of 60th percentile and our maximum of the 90th percentile based on comparing it to different points along the capability continuum. We can then estimate our most likely. Now the reason I don't like to then do the same type of triangulation or comparison to points along the continuum to do most likely is because most likely is directly tied to, the most likely value is actually directly tied to our confidence rating that we choose. The most likely value, technically speaking, is the point the highest point at the curve. It's where the curve, distribution curve, we're going to create peaks. So I think it's better if you use your calibration and estimation skills to actually arrive at that, because what you want to do is identify what I commonly call the, if you had to pick one number to represent resistive strength, what would that one number be? So using those types of methods, you can arrive at your most likely value, and then you'd understand what confidence rating you could choose. So I think that's a little better than applying the kind of triangulation to the points along the continuum to set your most likely, but you certainly can use other methods if you have some of those. So I've actually, when it comes to producing a confidence rating, to make it practical, I kind of put some ideas, some sentences around questions that I ask when I actually choose a confidence rating. And confidence rating being how sure you are that the most likely value is what you choose it to be. So I kind of apply these questions. I ask myself, do I have data that's directly related to the number that I'm choosing? If I do, then the confidence rating I can choose is high. Do I have some data that I kind of have to extrapolate to make applicable? An example would be I need to know how much the juice is I squeeze out of a grapefruit, but I only have oranges. Well, I have to kind of estimate how many oranges would make up the same size as a grapefruit, and then squeeze those and kind of do some math to decide how close it is to what a grapefruit would be. If I have to do those types of efforts, then my confidence rating is more toward a medium. If I have just fuzzy data and I really can't tell if it's directly related, but I'm trying to make some assertions from it, then that's a confidence rating of low. And lastly, if I have absolutely no clue at all, and I'm just kind of guessing at it, then my confidence rating I should choose should be very low. Now there's another way of going about this that I'll just mention in passing, and I found that some people kind of have difficult, especially if they are security experts or in the technical side of things, and they're just used to thinking about controls as technologies, and they have a difficult time giving you estimates or being led toward estimation exercises using the concept of a baseline measure of force. There's another way that sometimes I've found makes it simpler. It isn't as fancy. It isn't as maybe as true to the definitions of fair that are applied here. But what I've done is I've asked them to if they understand the control limitations, how close are your controls to the controls that could stop Tom Cruise? In other words, imagine a desired state, the desired state being something that would stop Tom Cruise. If those controls can stop Tom Cruise, then they're at a 90th to 99.9 percentile. Now do a comparison of how close your controls are to date, understanding the gaps you have in those controls, and then you can kind of do a comparison between those two and arrive at a resistance strength rating for those. And again, if you guys want me to explain that more, feel free to reach out to me. I just wanted to mention it in passing here, mostly because I have found it difficult sometimes in some settings for folks to grasp that kind of triangulation you could do along the points of the capability continuum. but they can envision, hey, I have a desired set of controls out there that I'd like to see that could do this. I have my gaps here. We can then estimate based on that knowledge there. So in summary, in order to use the concept of a baseline measure of force for helping you estimate resistance strength, the first thing we do, again, is model an attacker with nearly unlimited and progressively increasing skills and resources, such as Tom Cruise's Ethan Hunt. Then model various capabilities along the capability continuum to find other data points that we can compare it to. Gather our resistive control information, things it does well, the gaps and weaknesses, things that it doesn't do well. We then compare our ability to resist to the different TCAP points along the capability continuum, and that will help us triangulate to an estimation of minimum and maximum resistive strength. There's more summary. Again, you can also use the idea of equality and relevance of data to help us establish a confidence rating. We could also use the concept of how close are my controls to those controls that could resist Tom Cruise if we are struggling with the idea of relating resistance strength to points along the capability continuum. And last but not least, be sure to use your calibration and estimation skills to ensure that the estimates that you're doing are reliable, specifically when you're going to do the most likely rating. None of these things that I'm pointing out to you are meant to actually derive a specific range. They're not meant to point out the most likely result based on the need for that to make sure that you have the curve shape that you need that represents the data that you have. But again, it is a way to make sure that if you don't understand where to start and struggle with a systematic way of actually estimating RS, you can actually apply these things here to improve your ability to do exactly that. There is one word of caution, and I want to thank Chad, who's probably not on this call, but Chad Weinman, who works for CXOware, for actually pointing this out. And that is, when we do this comparison of resistive strength to points along the capability continuum, make sure you're not doing it to actual threat communities you've identified and modeled in your analysis. The reason they may actually match each other, but if you actually just try to do it against the threat community that you've identified in the analysis, what you're really doing is you're going to start muddling resistive strength and vulnerability. You're actually then performing the actual analysis in your head, and you're not comparing it to the ends of the capability continuum that you've identified. So it's important that you use points along the capability continuum for evaluating RS, and you keep it independent of the actual analysis itself. I don't know if you guys have any questions on that. Feel free to ask. But again, your actual threat community may actually be Tom Cruise. If that's fine, if that's the case, if it actually matches up. But make sure that if they don't match up, that you're doing it against points along the continuum itself and not against the actual threat community in the analysis. Believe it or not, folks, that is all. So thanks for the opportunity to present today, and some of you, I hope you find this useful. If you have any additional questions, or we kind of went over too quick, or you'd like me to go over something else, or you want to challenge some of the assumptions here, then feel free to reach out to me. Again, in our FAIR user community, this is kind of how we improve in and of ourselves. So I'm certainly open to talking with you folks more about it.
No, very good, Marty. I mean, it was a nice walkthrough. It was, I was trying to, in my own mind, determine, where I might have gone wrong in the past as well. And your last point was very, very relevant. So do you think that is one of the areas where people make the most common mistake when doing the RS capability?
I wouldn't know that I would call it a mistake. I would think it's been my experience that people struggle with how to actually get a reliable estimate of RS that's a method they can use that's consistent as they do every analysis. Some of it is inherent in the idea that resistance strength and threat capability aren't on defined measurable scales. So we have to create a scale to do them on. And simply saying the scale is 0 to 100 isn't sufficient, right? Because it's still, it doesn't, 0 to 100 isn't a measure of a specific set of skills or resources. And because we have the idea that these skills and resources are improving over time, we have to envision something on that continuum that can closely approximate that, what I call a model for it. And that's what kind of led me to, hey, well, let's envision somebody out there with that, and that's Tom Cruise. And on the other end, we're talking about the barely breathing. And then there's got to be some skills and resources that are kind of in the middle. And if we simply model those and follow kind of a triangulation approach, we can come to a reasonable minimum and maximum rating for the controls that we have in place.
So other than subject matter expertise, where do you get additional information on how effective your controls really are against those threat communities, or that on that continuum? Because you're going to say, well, I'm between 60 and 90. How can you test that in and of itself, that was an accurate assessment of your own controls?
Say that again, I'm sorry.
The question is, if, let's say I decide my controls that are protecting this asset fall between 60 and 90. That's my estimate. And my most likely is 80. And I've done that based on my subject matter expertise. What's the best way to test that my knowledge is up to date and that I properly position my resistance strength? Anyway, that's the question, if it's clear.
Well, because we can't actually go out and adequately actually test, because in order to test it, you'd have to find some of the points along the continuum that you compared it to and actually set up a real live scenario where they actually attacked your controls. And that's not viable in a real environment. So what it boils down to is your rationale that you use to describe it. And if you are able to demonstrate that you understand the weaknesses, the gaps in the controls that you have, you understand how you have some confidence that you understand how the controls are implemented and how good they are and where they could be improved. If you understand that, can articulate that, then the rest of your resistance strength rationale should be very supportable when you do the analysis. You also have the idea of actually when you run the scenarios. So you follow through and you plug all this into FAIR-IQ and you've identified a threat community and you have the rest of the scenario. When the Monte Carlo simulations are running, you look at the results. Do they pass the smell test? Again, we don't want to start adjusting the factors because they don't pass our smell test. That way, if we do that, then we haven't been true to the model and the analysis isn't of much value. But at the very least, it should pass the smell test. If it doesn't, you need to go back and look where you went wrong in your factors and go back through and see if the rationales were true, if the data points that you got were actually relevant, if there was some mistake you may have made along that process. If you then can solve those problems, the analysis should improve. But again, when we do apply FAIR, it is using estimations. It's using estimations based on the best data that we have, and it could be no data. And we simply state those rationales as we do the approach, so that if the analysis, so that if anyone wants to look at what we did, it's right there for them to read, and they can make suggestions or ask questions or at least understand the underlying suppositions that you've made in the analysis itself.
A little feedback from one of our current customers who is using FAIR-IQ as well as FAIR, and he said, you might want to point out on the call, those who have not been through FAIR training, that this is not as complicated as it sounds.
You know what? That's exactly a good point, and the reason I say it's not as complicated as it sounds is because I was never even FAIR trained, and I came up on this. My FAIR training was seat of the pants, and Jack helped me along the way and making a lot of mistakes doing analysis and having the taxonomy to its nth degree on a big printout there in my office. So if I can figure this out, you can figure out something close to it, and you can actually learn to do this exact thing on your own once you just simply have an introduction to FAIR and start applying it.